All right, I think we're live. This is the first time that I'm doing it this way, so there might be something wrong. I wish there could be a way that you could send me a message to confirm that everything is working fine. There is a Q&A queue, so you can post questions during the lecture. I should be able to see them here, and then I can just stop at any second and try to answer the question. If anyone is out there, you could try posting a question just to confirm that you can hear me, you can see my screen, so that I know for sure that I can start. So anyone, if you are out there, please say something. Yeah, it's fine. Cool. Thank you. So welcome to Data Analytics, TI 3130. My name is Julian. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Intelligent Systems in the Multimedia Computing Group. And I'm the one who's going to be the instructor for this course. And today I'm going to have, oh yeah, I see a lot of, thank you. Now I got a lot of messages saying it works. So today we're going to have the first lecture. I have to apologize because there was a little misunderstanding in terms of administration and Brightspace. I thought someone had to do something, but then they thought I was going to do it anyway. So anyway, we are live now. The slides are in there. We're going to have a lot more information by the end of today, maybe tomorrow. But at least the first two lectures, you know when they're going to be. The material is online, and we can start. So very quickly, what this course is going to be about. Let me move over here, get the pen. Oh yeah. So this course is going to be about more or less data science 101, a very rough introduction to data science. So we're going to be covering more or less this full pipeline from the point at which we make a design for a certain study. Now my pen is not working. Okay, this is not good. My pen is not working, but anyway. Let me move over here. Okay, I'll see later what happens. So let me just take a second. Okay, at least I can use the mouse, but my pen is not working. Okay, good. So yeah, so this course is going to be about everything that goes between the point where we design a certain study and the point at which we communicate our findings from that study. And there's a whole process that goes through it. So designing how we're going to collect the data, what kind of research questions we're going to ask. Then once we collect the data, we're going to go through this cycle in which we first try to explore it, try to visualize the data so that we can gather new insights about it. We can start modeling the data. We're going to see a few lectures about statistical modeling, how to transform the data, and in a way go through this cycle over and over again until we get useful insight about the process or the problem that we are trying to study, all in the hope that we can learn something new from it, or that we can answer certain questions and then communicate those questions. So today we're going to be talking about methods. So why do we need methods? We need methods if we're going to be the ones who design an experiment, who designs a survey, the ones who collect data, aggregate multiple data sources. If we are in charge more or less of these first steps of the pipeline in which we gather the data, it's going to be very important that we understand something about methods. But it's also going to be relevant if you are not part of that decision-making process of what data to collect, where to collect it from, etc. And you're just simply the person who analyzes the data. You're just a data analyst. It's going to be very important because you need to understand what design choices were made when collecting the data, when decided exactly what we're going to study, what kind of questions we're going to answer and how. And so it's going to be necessary for you as a data analyst to derive useful knowledge from data. And the thing is that we need to understand where the data comes from, what it represents, what it was collected for, what kind of questions was the data aimed for answering, what assumptions were made into collecting the data, what kind of limitations we have. All those are going to be very important by the time that you get into the data, start looking into it, analyze it, build models, and then answer questions. And it's very important nowadays because we have data all around us. It's all readily available for us. We have tons and tons of data just out there waiting for someone to look at them. And so we have plenty of data sets that are available just as is. There's tons and tons of data, and there's a lot of people looking at those data, but the kind of useful knowledge that we can derive from those data sets really depends on what that data represents. And we're going to talk plenty about this issue. So it's not just, getting a big data set, start running some numbers, building some models, and there you go. It's very important to understand what the data comes from. And in a sense, it's about preventing what we call data myopia. Data myopia is essentially this state in which we just get a data set, and regardless of any other context, we just look at the data set and keep looking at it, and then we make wrong conclusions because we don't look at the context of the data. We don't look at where the data comes from and what it represents. And so it's going to be essential to understand the problem. We really need to understand properly the problem that we are trying to solve when we analyze the data. And the conclusions are really going to depend on where the data comes from. So all in all, it's everything about making sure that the conclusions that we draw from data are based on evidence and evidence alone, nothing else. And this is important again, not only because you will conduct studies in this course or in the course of your career, but also because just as a plain citizen, you are consuming this kind of research all the time, either directly if you read someone else's work, some papers, some books, and indirectly if you're just reading the news, for example, because you are reading someone else's understanding of some piece of research. As we usually say, if you're reading the newspaper and you go to the science section or something that has to do with numbers, it's very likely that there's something wrong in there. And that is because people are really not prepared to understand certain things. I see a few questions. Yes, the lecture is going to be recorded. I will post the link once we're done, and the others are fine. Okay, so let's continue. So again, it's all about making sure that the conclusions we draw from data are based on evidence. And typically, we're going to be interested in three kinds of problems. One is going to be to look at the relationship between certain concepts, so how one is related to the other. The other one is going to be differences between concepts. So, for example, what is the difference in smoking habits between men and women? So how are they different, those two groups, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And the other one is going to be causality. So what is the thing that causes something else? And in the end, it's about gathering, again, evidence from a data. And we always focus on two aspects of such, analyzing data process. One is that we want our results, our conclusions, to be valid. And by valid, we mean that how we approach the analysis of the data, how the data was collected, the whole process was designed to address the question under study and not something else. We're going to see that it's very easy to make certain kind of mistakes during the process, such that whatever conclusion we make in the end cannot really be derived from the data we have alone. There actually is something else that is, messing with our results, and we have to be prepared to avoid those things and to detect them. And the other thing is that it has to be reliable, such that the data leads to reliable conclusions, in the sense that if I conduct this study again, am I going to be able to draw the same conclusion, yes or no? So how reliable am I into trusting the results that I have if I were to replicate the study? We're going to talk plenty about those two concepts through the course. So if you want to put it in just one sentence, it would be something like this. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And this course, and specifically these first 3 lectures about methods, are going to be all about setting apart what is opinion and what is fact, what can logically be derived from the data we have and what cannot. So it's all about this for these 3 first lectures. And that might seem trivial to you, but really it's not. Trust me. Here I have an example of a paper, I think it's from 3-4 years ago, in which they collected data from the Premier League, I think it was, the football league in the UK or in England. And what they were interested in answering was the question, are referees more likely to show a red card to black players than they are to white players? Yes or no? So they just collected data about, I don't know how many years of the Premier League games, and they gave those data to different research groups. I don't remember if it was in the UK or worldwide, but anyway, people who allegedly know what they're doing. And the results that they published were something like this. So, hey, but people, here's the data, analyze it however you want, and then tell us the result. Tell us the answer to this research question. Are referees more likely or not to show a red card to a black player? And so they had this visualization in which essentially we show, so the center of each of those bars represents the result. Each of the bars represents one different research group. And if we are around here, that means the answer to the research question is no, they are equally likely to show a red card to a white player or a black player. And so we see that there's a few studies around there. If we have the results around here, along the y-axis, along this direction, that means that they are twice as likely to show it to a black player. And over here, that means they are 3 times as likely. And so we see that there are certain groups that said there's no discrimination, or it's actually going the other way around. But the majority of people said there is a discrimination, and maybe even by a lot. Look at those 2 groups in there. The green ones are the ones that, for now, let's say they were very certain that there was such a difference between black and white players. So all these white dots represent research groups who, just after analyzing the data in their own way, they are very certain there is some discrimination. The ones that remain in green, in gray, are the ones that say we are not really sure, but it looks like there is something. So you see, same data, different people, different analysis, completely different results. So it really is important to understand where the data comes from, what research question we're going to analyze, how we analyze it, etc. Because in the end, really, it's not trivial how to answer these questions based on data alone. So again, this is just as an example that I hope sticks with you through the course. And so in today's lecture and the upcoming 2 lectures, we're going to talk about how to properly design a study, how to collect data, and all in the hope that we can learn something useful, valid and reliable from that data. And so today we're going to talk about data-driven studies, variables and their relationships, third variable problems, and sources of variability and error. So again, coming back to the three types of study that we generally have in data-driven studies. So there are descriptive, correlational, and causational. Descriptive is just something that wants to describe something that exists. Let's say that I own a pizza place, and I'm interested just in knowing how much fuel are the delivery guys consuming. So I'm interested in the fuel consumption of the motorbikes that we use for pizza delivery. Or maybe this is a kind of actual one. What is the vote intention for the next elections? We know it always fails, but we can try to predict it. Sometimes we're interested in correlational studies, and that means study the relationship between certain things. For example, I own a beer company. This is actually a real study, and I'm interested in seeing if there's differences in sales between men and women. Or maybe I'm interested in seeing what the difference is between different children according to their age in terms of reading comprehension. So I want to know how well children read, depending on whether they are 5 years old, 6 years old, 7, 8, etc. Then we have causal studies in which we want to determine what is the cause of something else. So for example, let's say that I work in an educational program, and we introduce a new program, a new course, a new methodology, something like that, and we want to test whether the scores in the course are actually going up or down. So you can think, for example, of a midterm. We test in the midterm, then we change something else, and then after the course, we have the final test and we compare the results. Did that thing actually have an effect or not? Or let's say that I work in Google, and I'm working in the interface design of the search engine, and I want to see if certain changes in the interface have an effect on how often people click on the ads, or what kind of ads people click on. So these are the kind of questions we're typically interested in. And if you want to put it into a nice visualization, a drawing, it usually is something like this. So we have a certain process that we are interested in studying. It could be natural, it could be artificial, but in any case, something that we want to study. And there are certain inputs to that and certain outputs. So for example, here we could have students as the input, and the output could be the test scores. Here we could have users of the search engine, and here we could have certain measurements of how often they click on the ads, or certain behavior in terms of ads. And the process is going to be affected by or driven by certain factors. And we're interested in seeing what is the effect of those factors into the output. So for example, here we could have the educational program. Here we could have the age of children. We could have the interface design, etc., etc. So we're interested in trying to understand how this process works, such that we can start answering questions about how these factors are affecting the outputs. And it all boils down to how we measure everything. What kind of variables do we have, and what relationships there are between the variables. And so the variables are in general factors of interest, things that we are interested in measuring somehow and studying. And those factors are going to be, again, measured by variables. So sometimes those concepts that we want to study, so those factors are not going to be directly available to us. There is something that we cannot directly measure, but might be approximated somehow, but something else that it's kind of similar, it's correlated to it, it's maybe simpler, something that can act as a proxy. So for example, there's no direct way of measuring human intelligence, but we have plenty of tests that can tell us something like the IQ, something that is expected to be correlated somehow with that. And we can have a variable measuring that, or multiple variables. We're going to talk about it. But the point is, we want to model those factors of interest through one or multiple variables, whatever they are. And we typically make this differentiation between independent variables and dependent variables. So the independent variable is one that is or can be manipulated by us, the researchers, or nature. So for example, probably if we want to measure, again, reading comprehension, the age is something that we cannot control, but nature in a sense does. So just the age of a person is just given to us. and we cannot do anything about it. We can still measure it. Same with the sex of a person. If we work in a hospital, the kind of injury that someone has, we cannot control, but we can control the kind of treatment that we give to that person. So those would be independent variables, things that are manipulated either by us or nature. And then we have the dependent variables, those that are presumably affected by the independent variables. And we want to see what relationship there is. How are the independent variables affecting the dependent variables? So we have some examples here. Imagine that I work in the transportation department of Delft or Amsterdam, the country, and I want to see what is the average door-to-door travel time. That would be the dependent variable. How that depends on the frequency of trains. Imagine that I can have some saying in what the frequency of trains is going to be. I might be interested in studying this. Or if I work in computer science, the time that it takes an algorithm to run, that would be the dependent variable. Of course, it's going to depend on the amount of memory that the computer has, the programming language, the format of the input data, etc. Those are the independent variables. And then in terms of, again, surgical procedures, what procedure, what age the patient has, what is the experience of the surgeon, all those are independent variables that presumably affect the recovery time, which is the dependent variable. So you see there are things that we can control, things that we cannot control. And if we go back to this picture, it actually looks more something like this. We know that the process is presumably affected or controlled by factors that we can control and factors that we cannot control. Still, we can measure them, we can put them into our whole data science pipeline, and we might be able to see how they are affecting the response. But it's important to understand that there are certain things that we can control and certain things that we cannot control, and that's going to be very important. So again, the question is, what is the effect of those independent variables on the response, on the output? So all these controllable factors, the inputs, and the uncontrollable factors will be independent variables, presumably affecting how the process leads to a certain response, a certain output or dependent variable. And so it's all about relationships between those independent variables and dependent variables, and among the independent variables themselves. We typically talk about correlation. So how are those things correlated? What is the correlation between, for example, the age of children and reading comprehension scores? Something that it's very typical in books is the correlation between height and weight. We know that there is this positive correlation between the height of a person and the weight of a person. We know the relationship is not perfect, so for a certain height, there's a very certain variation in terms of weight, but there is this positive correlation, of course. The taller you are, the more you weigh, the heavier you are. We also know there is this correlation between how much you study, what kind of degrees you get, and how much salary you get in your job. We know that the farther you study, the higher your salary is. Of course, again, there's variation. There's other factors affecting the salary, such as the experience, such as the type of job that you have, but there is this positive correlation. So, keep studying. And of course, how we measure this correlation, this relationship between variables, depends on the type of variables that we have. So for example, if both variables are numerical, such as the height and the weight, we typically are interested in seeing whether the correlation, the relationship is positive or negative. So does one of them go up or down when the other one goes up? What is the relationship? Do they go up or down? If the two variables are categorical, we're typically interested in count differences. So imagine that we are interested in seeing if there are differences in terms of smoking or not smoking between men and women. It would be just about counting how many cases we have in each of the combinations. So how many men smoking, how many women smoking, non-smoking, etc. And then we look at the differences. And this is probably the most typical one. If one is categorical and the other one is numerical, we're typically interested in seeing what is the difference in the numerical variable across the different categories of the categorical variable. So you can think, for example, of different treatments for a certain disease and recovery time. So we are interested in seeing what is the recovery time across those different treatments that we may apply. And it's very important to realize that the relationship is not necessarily linear or monotonic. The example I always give is about the drug dose and health. So imagine that we could plot over here the dosage. Normally I would use a pen, but for some reason it's not working. I'll check it out later. So I'm writing now with my mouse. And here we have the recovery time. So we know that as we start administering a certain dosage of the drug, sorry, not the recovery time. This is the health of the patient. And so as we start administering some drug, the health is going to go up a little bit, going to go up, up, up. But sure enough, there's a certain point at which if we administer even higher doses, then the health is going to go down. We are actually going to hurt the patient because we are overdosing the drug. And so it will go something like this. Now, depending on how you analyze the data and depending on how you look at it, you might find that there is no relationship between the two of them because it goes up and then it goes down. So you might say the correlation is 0, but it's very important to understand that it's just nonlinear. And so it depends on how you approach the analysis of the data. If you just look at the numbers blindly without looking at them, you might conclude that the correlation is 0, that there is no effect. And in general, it would be something like this, the kind of things that we look at. So it would be something like in the top left, we have relationship between the horsepower of a car and the miles per gallon. And we see that the higher the horsepower of the car or the vehicle, then the fewer miles you can run with it. So there is this clear negative correlation between the two variables. Over here on the right, we have the petal length of 3 different types of flowers, and we see that there are differences across them in terms of the petal length. Again, this would be a clear correlation between those 2 variables. Here we have the satisfaction over 6 different products and how many people are in each of the categories. So we see a lot of people are very satisfied or somewhat satisfied here with product C, somewhat satisfied over here, and we could see differences across the different products. And finally, the other kind of study was causation. And in this kind of studies, what we ask is the independent variable or which independent variable causes the change in the dependent variable? So what is the reason? So you can think, for example, of this one. Higher professional experience leads to higher salary. We know that the higher or the farther you study, the higher your degree, then the higher your salary is going to be. We know that. But really what's making the difference, really what's causing a higher salary is your professional experience. There's always this effect. The farther you've been employed in a certain job, then the more likely you are to get a higher salary. And this one, it's a very interesting one. If you ask people who smoke, they're going to tell you that if they're stressed after smoking, they are not going to be stressed. So smoking relieves from stress. And I don't smoke myself, but everyone is going to tell you this. If I smoke, then stress is going to go away. So we could say that smoking is the factor causing the change in the dependent variable. This would be the level of stress. So if you smoke, it's causing a change in stress. Think about this one for a second. We're going to go back to it. So what do we require in order to conclude that something is causing something else? Well, the first thing that we need to have is a correlation between the 2 variables, correlation between the dependent variable and the independent variable. So of course, if a change in the independent variable causes a change in the other one, we have to see a certain correlation that when the dependent variable has changed, the independent variable has changed too. Otherwise, there has to be something else explaining the change. The second requirement is that the change in the independent variable has to happen before the change in the dependent variable. This seems logical, right? We should only observe the change in the other one after we have changed the independent variable. And the tricky part is there's no alternative explanation. And this is why these kind of problems are tricky. In the end, it's about, could there be anything else affecting the dependent variable, affecting the response? Am I missing something in my study? Is there maybe some other variable that is really causing the change? Maybe also in the independent variable. Maybe there's something else that causes the change in both variables, and I just don't know about it. Could that be the case? And there's plenty of cases throughout history in which this was actually the case. To the best of our knowledge, there was nothing else, and therefore we could say, hey, this is causing this other thing. But then afterwards, of course, 50 years later, then there's a new study showing, hey, it's actually because of this other thing. So it's very easy to see that there's a correlation. It's very easy to confirm that one change is happening before the other one. It's not at all easy to, remove all other explanations from the picture. There's plenty of things that could affect, and we just don't know. And so it's very important when you analyze data to realize that if you see the correlation between two variables in whatever form, that does not automatically imply causation. So you can think, for example, of cancer incidence and the number of websites. We know that through time, we have more and more websites on the internet, of course. And we also know that there is more and more cases of cancer detected. Can we say that one is causing the other one? Of course, that would be nuts. But this is a very stupid case in which if you just look at the data, you see this positive correlation between the two variables. You might be inclined to say, hey, one is causing the other one. And if you think about it, when you read all about these risk factors in medicine, so I don't know, eating red meat is a risk factor in heart diseases. For the most part, those are correlational studies. So after the fact, they look at the patients and they say that there are certain correlations. So patients who have a certain disease, it turns out that they had a certain behavior. They ate more meat. But that's only correlational. Then you need a lot of theory, a lot of background knowledge to try to support the argument that one thing is causing the other one, and ultimately a properly designed experiment to say this thing is causing this other thing. But for the most part, to the best of our knowledge, it's just correlational. There are things that co-vary together, but we are not really certain whether one is affecting the other or not. And the point is that when you have the data set, if you keep looking long enough, you're going to find something. Eventually, there's going to be something in there that does not imply first that the thing that you see is really in there, it's really real. It could be just, a happy coincidence. And even if there is something, that does not imply that there is causation, that one is causing the other. As I like to say, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess anything. And we see in many cases that people just tend to torture the data. They try to look at the data from every different angle to try to have something, try to find anything. And this is specifically important when you just get a data set, you start analyzing the data set, but without any specific research question in mind. You're just looking for something. You're fishing for some insight, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. So this is very important with large studies, with many variables, big data stuff. If you have hundreds of variables, thousands of variables, we have plenty of data sets like that nowadays. Of course, there's going to be something. Of course, there's going to be things that are correlated to each other. That does not mean that one is causing the other. It's just happy coincidence. Things just happen to be correlated. And this is why theoretical frameworks and background knowledge are important to allow us to recognize that whenever we see something, whenever we see a correlation, it might be just statistical fluke. It might be just happy coincidence. And we have to be prepared to detect those things and to wonder whether the things that we see just by looking at the data really mean something or not. So I want to show you very quickly this website about the spurious correlations, and then we can have a break. I have it over here. Let me see. There. Bigger. There's this website in which they have a lot of data from the US. And it's a nice way of seeing what we mean about statistical correlation and causation. So the thing is that you can choose between different variables. So let's say I want to look at divorce rates. That would be one variable. And then we are going to look into another variable. So let me see. I'm going to go through, I don't know, Ohio. And here, it's going to give us other variables that they have in their huge data sets and how tightly they are correlated with divorce rates. So for example, we see that there is a high correlation between divorce rate and the consumption of margarine, and the correlation is very high. It's 0.97. The highest it's going to be a 1, so this is very high. There's also one about how much oil the US imports from Norway. Of course, no one's going to say that divorce rates are caused because of Norwegian oil, but if you just look at the data, there is this very clear positive correlation. So one might be inclined to say, hey, it's all because of of Norway. I suggest you look at the site. Just go ahead, have some fun, find these stupid correlations. Proportion of engineers awarded to women, engineering degrees. That's completely absurd. Murders by blunt object. That could be a reason to get divorced. So see, if you just gather a lot of data and you see there's dozens and dozens of variables, you're going to find something. That doesn't mean that something is real. So I think I'm going to stop here and then we can have a break. Let's say we come back at 11:35 and then we continue with the lecture. I'll see if I can answer a few questions. And the thing is going to keep recording as far as I know. So I'll see you in a minute. I'm coming back at 11:35. See you in a minute. All right, we can continue. So we were talking about causation. And there are two things that are important to keep in mind all the time. The first one is that this temporal precedence, the change in the independent variable being observed before the change in the dependent variable, may easily confound us if we don't properly understand the problem we're looking at. And just imagine for a second, imagine that we have aliens visiting Earth for the first time, and they come to the Netherlands and they see windmills. They're rotating. Without any proper understanding of what the hell is going on, they might say, hey, this wind that I feel is caused by that thing over there that is spinning. And it's actually the other way around. The thing is spinning because of the wind. And actually, technically, the rotation of the windmill is really creating a little bit of wind. And so the alien is going to say, hey, what's going on here? Apparently, it's the other way around. So how can I know? It's very important to have a proper understanding of the problem that you're looking at, because otherwise you might be fooled by windmills and wind, right? Or the thing about smoking and stress. Well, it actually depends, because the point is that you are going to be stressed at some point if you don't smoke. And actually, smoking is the reason why you're stressed in the first place. So, of course, once you smoke, the stress is going to be relieved, but you're stressed in the first place because you're not smoking. So it's actually the other way around. And it's very hard to be sure that there is no other alternative explanation. There are, of course, always unknown factors, things that we cannot control, things that we do not know, that might be affecting the response, the output. And actually, it turns out that stress depends on profession. If you are someone working on the stock market, you're going to be a lot more stressed than if you're a gardener. This is fact. And whether you smoke in the first place or not, that is going to affect your stress level. So it's really non-trivial if you just look at the data to be sure that something causes something else. Normally, you are not going to be able to say that. The best you can say is they're correlated. And then you have to properly design an experiment to prove it. And I like this example here. This is XKCD. It's a comic online. I strongly suggest that you go online and take it out. And there's this guy with a hat. He's the one who always knows everything, of course. And someone says there's a new study finding no evidence that cell phones are causing cancer. And actually, he thinks it's the other way around. He actually collected the data, and it looks like this. So throughout the years, in black, we have the total cancer incidence. It's going up. And we have in red cell phone users. And you ask now the questions. Is there a correlation between cancer incidence and cell phone users? Yes, there is. They're both going up. Is cancer incidence happening before? Yes, it's increasing before the increase in cell phone users. Is there anything else? If I just want to be quick, I'm going to say, no, I can't think of anything else. Therefore, cancer is causing cell phones. We know that this is completely nuts. But again, if you just look at the data without any proper understanding of what the data means, any theoretical framework, any background knowledge, you might fall into things like this. There is a nice study 2-3 years ago, maybe, in which they saw that software developers who use spaces instead of tabs, they make more money. And they collected data from Stack Overflow, I think it was. And yeah, if you use spaces, you get more money. So, people might think, hey, start programming using spaces instead of tabs. No, that's nonsense. They actually found out there's a URL down here. I suggest you go take a look in which they were investigating what was going on. And it turns out that it was normally or it was expected to be something that had to do with people contributing to open source problems or not. But again, if you just look at the data blindly, hey, everyone start using spaces. And if you read the news, you're going to have things like that all the time. there's two in here that I like, 2, 3. The first one is chocolate may help keep people slim. Eat chocolate and then you're going to be slim. This is an actual headline of a news article. Of course, it's nonsense, but hey, science found that whatever. Going to university increases the risk of getting a brain tumor, apparently. Or this is one that I liked a lot from the pandemic now. There's this study in which they show that bald men are 40% more likely to end up in the hospital because of COVID-19. And then you start asking questions. Were you guys taking into account that older people are bald and they are more severely affected by the virus? That is not really because they are bald, it's just because they're older. And that is the variable that is actually determining whether they are hospitalized or not. Or hey, here in the chocolate case, well, it's actually that slim people can afford to eat more chocolate because they're slim. They don't have any problem. And it's not that they're slim because they eat chocolate. They eat chocolate because they are slim. So you see, there's plenty of studies like this or headlines like this everywhere. You need to properly understand that, it's all nuts. And again, it's very important if you are just given the data set and you don't know where the data was coming from or how it was collected or what kind of question it was intended to answer. It's very important that we know this. We're going to see why in the coming lecture. Here we have the example of an inconvenient truth. This is a documentary by Al Gore. He ran for president in the US like 20 years ago. He got a Nobel Prize for his work in, making people aware of the global warming problem. And he had this presentation in which he was plotting the CO2 levels in the planet and temperature, going back many hundreds of thousands of years. And his exact words were the two graphs obviously move in lockstep with each other. When there is more carbon dioxide, temperature gets warmer. And if you look at the plot, you say, damn, he's right. But the point is there a better way to plot the relationship between CO2 and temperature? Instead of looking at this, is there a better way? Well, why don't just plot one versus the other in a scatter plot? And then we would get something like this. And yes, there is this very clear correlation between the two variables, right? We have this very clear positive trend. When there is CO2 high, then temperature variation is high. Now the point is there anything weird in this plot? And the answer is yes, right there. The measurement of today, again, today might be 10 years ago or something like that, 15 years ago. The point was that if you look at the data for today, it's really off the chart. The relationship, it's very different. And if you look at it in the scatter plot, you actually have to extend the scatter plot figure towards the right to be able to plot today. So what we have here is a very clear relationship when we look back, but something is going on when we observe today. And there has to be something else. Now, of course, I'm not denying global warming or anything. What I'm saying is there is something else. And we know there is something else. It's not only CO2. There's more greenhouse effect gases. So again, this is a case in which if you only look at the data, you might say one is causing the other one. Well, there might be something else, and we just don't know about it. This is another example that I like a lot. This is data about storks and birds. Storks are these birds that are supposed to come from Paris, bringing babies to homes. And I don't remember if this was by country or by city, something like that. Anyway, there was certain observations in which we had the number of storks and the birth rate, so how many babies are being delivered. And we had this positive correlation. So we might say, it looks like, the myth is true. Babies are being delivered by storks. Can you think of what other variable might be the reason why we observe this correlation? It's very simple. It's actually because of the area of the city or the country. Again, I don't remember. So it turns out that in a larger country, there are more storks, of course. And in a larger country, there tends to be more people, of course. More people means more births, of course. So the positive correlation is actually caused by the area of the region, of the country, or the city. It's not that births are caused by storks. It's just, there's more of the two of them because of the conditions of the variables that we're measuring, because of the area. And in general, we have problems like this all the time. Other third variables that we are not accounting for and might be the reason why we observe the effect that we observe. So I like to differentiate between these two, lurking and confounding. A lurking variable is one that we don't know about. It's unknown to us. And it's actually the one that causes the variation in the dependent variable. So it's actually the reason why the dependent variable is changing, and possibly the reason why the independent variable changes too. So we are completely missing the reason. And there is this other variable that we don't know about. It's lurking, so to speak, and it's completely messing our results. And I like to give this example. Imagine that we have data about the number of firefighters that attend to a certain fire in a building and the damage from the fire. If you just look at the data, it will look something like this. So here's the number of firefighters, you have the data. Here's the damage, you have the data. Of course, there's going to be a correlation in there. The more firefighters, the higher the damage. So one might say, hey, stop sending firefighters to the buildings, because the more people we send over, the higher the damage. So stop sending people. And the fact is, we are only looking at these two. But of course, there is a third variable that we are missing. Let's say something like the size of the fire, the intensity, the magnitude. Let's call it magnitude. If there is a big fire, there's going to be higher damage. And of course, we have to send more people, more firefighters, to try to suffocate it. If we just look at the correlation between these two variables, we are going to say stop sending people. It's actually because we are missing this other variable in here. Again, this is a pretty stupid example, but illustrates that if you only have these two columns of data and you don't have this lurking variable, you're going to make stupid conclusions. And the other one is what we call confounding variables. These are things that are known to us. These are variables that we do have in our data set, but may cause the variation in the dependent variable. We just cannot distinguish that effect from that of the other independent variables. So if we look at the numbers, if we look at the data, it's going to be impossible to really tell whether the effect comes from this variable or from another variable. And I like to give again this example of the aroma or the quality of two coffee brands brewed in two different machines. So imagine that we have data about two different brands of coffee. So I may have a column of brand of coffee here, let's say brand 1, brand 2. And then I brew coffee on two different machines. Here we have the machine. And I always brew coffee 1 on machine 1 and coffee 2 on machine 2. Then my dependent variable is going to be the aroma or the quality, whatever. So we have a measurement there. If we have this data, then it's going to be impossible for us to say, if we observe a difference between these two, a difference in aroma, is it because of the different brands of coffee, or is it because the different machines? There's no way that we are going to be able to answer this question properly. Regardless of how much data you have, regardless of how many times you repeat the experiment, regardless of what statistical techniques you apply, it's going to be plain impossible to tell whether the difference in aroma is caused by the brand of coffee or by the machine. And this is a case in which we have all three variables. They are part of a data set. We know them. We may be even able to control them, but there's no way to tell the difference between one or the other with respect to their effect on the response. So this is what we call confounding. Those two variables, the brand of coffee and the machine, are confounded with each other. And so confounding is something that we have to think about when we are designing the study to see what combinations of brewing coffee with what machine and what brand we are going to run. And lurking variables is something that we have to think about when we are planning the study. So which are the variables that we are going to measure? And these are what we call third variable problems. Variables that are going to be affecting the response and we just don't know it or cannot be able to, not able to differentiate between one or the other. And it's important to realize that there are certain properties of the problem that are going to be third variable problems, like what we saw of the area in the countries and the number of storks and the number of people. Time is also very often a problematic third variable because things just evolve with time. If you look at the number of buildings in the planet and the number of birth rate, of course, they're going to be positively correlated. Those are just two things that evolve with time. There's no correlation with one another. It's just how things are. Or CO2 emissions and obesity. It's just how it is. It's also important to realize that the properties of groups, such as the size of the group, might be a confounder too. So again, the storks and the babies, and deaths by country in COVID-19. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of statistics about the coronavirus. And a lot of the times we're just comparing countries, and it doesn't make any sense to compare countries because they're just different. They have different properties and no one is accounting for those properties. Also, if we have any proper analysis, of course, we might be hiding two relationships or even reversing the relationships. Think about the example of the health of a patient and the amount of the drug that we are administering. And maybe the independent variables are not the only reason why the dependent variable is changing. Think about the CO2 problem and temperature. Of course, if you have a complex phenomena under study, a complex process, there's going to be plenty of other factors that are affecting, and maybe you don't know about them, and those are the reason. And especially if your data involves human in some way, well, it's going to be plenty of other factors that are affecting whatever you're measuring because we are complex creatures. There's a lot going on with us, and it's completely impossible to fully model human behavior. Another example, it's recently the different testing policies. We see all these numbers about the number of positive tests, PCR tests, etc., etc. But every country has a different testing policy. You cannot just compare numbers between two countries because they're testing different people. So it doesn't make any sense. Still, of course, we do it because we like to compare. And there are other kinds of third variables. I'd like to mention mediating and moderating variables. So mediating, for example, you can think of this correlation between how well you drive and your age. It's actually because you are more cautious when you're older than when you're younger. So there's this relationship between age and driving, but mediated by how cautious you are. It's not the one is directly causing the other one, it's really because of this caution. And there's also moderating variables that influence the relationship. So for example, we know there is a relationship between social class. I believe this was for women in medical self-examinations for breast cancer. And how often they self-examine. There is a relationship between social class, but moderated by age. So it turns out that women of high social class, if they are young, they do not self-examine as they should, or different from the others. It's actually a difference when they get older. That's when they start self-examining. So there is this relationship, but it's moderated by how old they are. And in the end, if we go back to this picture again, it's important to realize that there is plenty of unknown things we don't know that might be affecting the process. And if we ignore them, or if we do not account for them, they might be giving us the illusion of, finding something in the data that it really is not, or finding a certain conclusion about something causing something else that really is not true. So all the time, please keep in mind that, for all practical purposes, the amount of things you don't know about the process is infinitely larger than the amount of things that you do know about the process. There's a lot of things that go on and you don't know about. And an example I like to give is Simpson's paradox. This is something that became very popular in the 70s, and it has to do with Berkeley University in California. They were looking at data about admissions to different departments, and what they found was that if they look at the difference between men and women, they found that 44% of men were admitted to the departments, 35% of women, and so they were saying, hey, there seems to be some discrimination against women. It actually turns out that when you look at the department level, it's not so clear-cut, and it's a little bit of the opposite. And the reason we're going to see in the coming slide is that women tended to apply to departments in which it was harder to get into in the first place. So of course, if you just disregard this third variable department and you only look at the aggregate numbers, you're going to be fooled because you think there's going to be this discrimination when actually it's not. It's because they are applying to different departments, to different places. The properties of men in this case are different from the properties of women because they're applying to different places. And so Simpson's paradox is this paradox in which the effect that we observe at the group level disappears or is even reversed when you look at the subgroups of your data, in this case, the departments. So again, this university-wide effect is actually gone once you start looking at the department level. There's nothing. And the thing is that this implies somehow the existence of a third variable that you can group by, in this case, the department. You can group by all your observations group by department. And then this variable is not necessarily something that you know, or even if you know, it's not something that you are necessarily able to control. And going back to everything that we have seen, some departments are just more competitive than others. It's just the way it is. And so you have to account for this factor, the department, before you are able to conclude something about discrimination. And so the assumption that we have all the time when looking at data is that everything depended only on the main factor. So everything else was equal. And if it's not equal, then that means we are making wrong assumptions and probably wrong conclusions. We're going to talk plenty about this through the course. Another example of Simpson's paradox is this case from 1986 in which they were looking at kidney stones. There were two treatments. Treatment A was invasive, treatment B was non-invasive, and they were looking at the success rates. And it turns out that the non-invasive treatment was more successful, 83% of the cases. So they were wondering, why are we applying the invasive treatment if it's less successful? And in this case, we do have the same amount of data in both treatments. So what's going on here? It turns out that we do not have control over which treatment is applied to which patient. So there's this third variable that is the size of the kidney stones. And the thing was, patients with small kidney stones, they were administered treatment B first because, hey, the problem is not so bad. Let's try with the non-invasive treatment. And if the problem is large, then we try with the invasive one to begin with because we don't want to risk it. And then it turns out that when you look at the data at that level, partitioned by the size of the stones, in both cases, treatment A was more successful. So the problem was, again, that when we look at the data at this level, we are assuming everything else is the same. And it turns out that the patients being administered treatment A are different from those administered treatment B. So actually, the difference that we are observing over here are differences across stone sizes. Again, this is something that, unless you know, you're going to make wrong conclusions. There is this other case about deaths and survivals of people depending on whether they smoke or not. Surprisingly, they found, of course, that people not smoking, they were more likely to survive after 20 years. Smokers were more likely to survive. There was a lower mortality rate. So they were saying, start smoking because you're going to live longer. And of course, once you start looking at the data, I'm going to skip it a little bit. What you found is that if you look at the distribution by age, the group with smokers had just 8% of old people. The group of non-smokers had a 27%. So of course, those were just people who were very likely to die within the next 20 years. And this study was just rigged from the beginning. There's this other third variable, which is the age that they were not properly documenting. Of course, they accounted for it because they knew what's going to happen. It's just when you analyze the data, if you ignore it, then you're going to see this problem. Of course, if you smoke, you're more likely to die. There's this other one in which we had the demand of cell phones, and as a function of when or how long they have been in the market, there is expected to have this negative correlation. The longer a cell phone has been on the market, then the lower the price should be. It turns out that if you look at the data, there's no correlation at all. And it's also because we are not accounting for the variable for time periods. And it turns out that once you get the time that the cell phone has been available and you go into different groups. So for example, week 1 to week 75, you see this very negative correlation. 50 weeks or so after that, there's also the negative correlation. And then after that, again, the negative correlation. So the point is, if you ignore the time dimension, you are not going to see this effect that you were expected to see. In reality, we do see this negative correlation in the data. If you don't look at the groups, it's going to appear like there's nothing. This is again Simpson's paradox. So be aware that this is very likely to happen when you just look at the data. And the other paradox that I want to talk about is the inspection paradox. I have a question. Can you adjust correct for the different age distribution in different data sets? Yes, you can. You do it either when you design your study and you have what we call a balanced data set, a balanced study. So you have the same amount of people in each category. And if you cannot do it, or you don't have anything to do with the design of the study, there are ways to controlling for that when you analyze the data. We're going to talk plenty about that. It's about including all those variables in a statistical model that allows you to remove that effect from the equation and just look at the main factor of interest. So the other one is the inspection paradox. And let me ask you this question. I'm sure you've been thinking about this many times. So you are there in the train platform, you are waiting for the train, and then you start wondering, looks like I'm waiting too long. They say it's once every 10 minutes, but to me it looks longer. I'm sure you've been there before. So let's say that on average, trains arrive every 10 minutes. This is what they say. Let me again. I hope I can get my pen working for next time because this is a mess. So every 10 minutes we have a train. How long are you expected to wait on the platform? Well, if you do the math, it should be about 5 minutes, right? You are either closer to when the train just left or closer to when the train is about to arrive. On average, you're expected to wait about 5 minutes. But the thing is, your arrival to the platform is also what we call a random event. And even if the average is 10 minutes, sometimes you arrived at a time in which the train is going to arrive soon. Sometimes you are at a time, you're arriving at a time in which the train is going to arrive late. So imagine that each of these circles is the arrival of a train. On average, they arrive every 10 minutes. So if you're lucky and you arrive here, the train is going to come very soon. If you are unlucky and you arrive in this interval, then you're going to wait a lot longer. And the point is, you are more likely to begin with to arrive at a longer interval because it's longer. It's more likely that you end up in this one or in this one than you are on arriving to this other one. So your perception is going to be that, hey, I always wait a lot more than 5 minutes, or I wait more than 5 minutes on average. They're lying to us. No, they're not. This is why it's a paradox. On average, it arrives every 10 minutes. It's just how you're measuring, which is dependent on when you arrive to the platform, it's going to affect your results. And let me give you this other example. Let's say that you want to know how many students per class there are in a certain school. You have two options at least to try to figure it out. So option number one is you go to the school, you ask for the registry, and you do the numbers and say, hey, it looks like there's 60 students per class. Option number 2, if you don't have access to the registry, is you just wait outside the school. Please never do this. You just wait outside the school and then you start asking kids, hey, how many kids are in your school, in your class? How many how many kids are there in your class? Another one, how many kids are there in your class? And then you average. Now, if you do that, you find out that there's 78 students per class. Which one is right? Apparently, you're just going out, making observations, and then averaging. It should be the same number, right? Well, it's not expected to be the same number. Why? Because classes are different. If this is the school, then if you just start asking students, out of the school, you're more likely to ask a student from this class than you're from asking a student of this class. And of course, the problem is all students in here are overrepresenting that group. This group of 100 students are overrepresented. And so if you go for option number 2, you are overrepresenting. This is again the inspection paradox. You're more likely to look at data over here, therefore you are overrepresenting this group. And so this is again something that is going to happen to you all the time. At least be aware that it could be the case and be prepared to detect it in someone else's analysis. And then that leads me to this final part of sources of variability and error. So we know about variables, we know about independent variables, dependent variables, factors affecting the response, third variables, etc., etc. Confounding, Simpson's paradox, whatnot. What we're interested in really is in variability and error. How are things varying? So it's important that you have a very clear research hypothesis, a research question. It's the statement of what is or is not expected to happen. So, for example, there is the train is arriving at a 10 minutes average. That could be a research question, and you might be able to answer it. Or there is no relationship and cancer. Or I don't know, treatment B leads to a lower recovery time than treatment A. So those are examples of research questions that you might be able to answer through data. Those questions, those hypotheses, it's very important that they are falsifiable. And that means that it's possible to disprove them through observation. If you have the right data to disprove them, then that's good. There might be other research questions that you cannot answer through data. And then those are not the ones that you want to look for because it's impossible to disprove them. There's no, it's always a win-win situation. No one can disprove them, so there you go. You have to look for questions that are going to be able to be disproved through observation. The very clear example is this one about white swans. Up until 1697, there was this Dutch salesman who went to Australia, I think it was, and there he found black swans. Until then, everyone thought that swans were only white. You make one observation of a black swan, and sure enough, that hypothesis is disproved. It's the same thing when you look at data. And it's important to remember that the absence of evidence is not evidence of the absence. Just because you don't observe a certain effect of one variable or another one, because you don't observe a difference across groups, that doesn't mean there's not. That means your data does not show that difference, or this one particular study did not show that difference. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So maybe you still haven't observed it, or maybe how you analyze the data is not the proper way to try to see that difference or that effect. We'll talk about this in the third lecture. So it's very important that you all the time keep in mind, if you don't observe something, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So clearly stating the hypothesis is really one of the most important steps in any data-driven study. What is it that you are going to look for? What is it that you want to answer with data? And never change that question. How you collect data, how you analyze data is going to depend on the research question. Many times we see it done the other way around. People collect data and then they start asking questions. And the thing is, you should not do that, because the questions that you ask, if it's done by looking at the data, they're going to be biased by what you found in the data. Maybe it's just a coincidence. So really, one of the most important things that you can do in any data-driven study is sit down and think what is it that you actually want to study. I think we'll talk later about what happens if you make hypotheses based on what you see in the data. And so the way that I find it most useful to think about it is think in terms of functions. So what do the dependent variables depend on? And write it down as a function to try and think about the research question. So something like this: the dependent variables are a function of the independent variables. This function is the process that we want to study. So I could say the quality of coffee is a function of the brand of coffee. It's going to depend on it. And the point is, when you're designing your study, when you're writing it down on a piece of paper, try to be as thorough as possible and include in that function all the factors that could possibly affect the response. So really, the quality of coffee is not only a function of the brand, it probably also depends on the type of roasting of the coffee, the country of origin, and the brewing time. Of course, these are things that affect the quality. So be as thorough as possible. And maybe you are able to control this one, but not that one. Still, it's going to allow you to first try to see what is the effect of this, try to disentangle the effect of the brewing time and the brand of coffee, and realize the limitations of your study. It depends on the country of origin. Maybe you cannot control it, but it's going to allow you to put into perspective the results that you have. And include variables even if you cannot control them. Again, even if they don't vary, even if they're constant. For example, even if you have the same machine, be aware that the brewing machine is going to affect the results. Even if you only have one, make that explicit in the function. So what are the factors that could affect the dependent variable? Again, it's going to allow you to realize what assumptions you're making and make better sense of the data. So it's not only the function or the factors that we saw earlier, it's also the machine, the water, the temperature, the pressure, etc., etc. Even if you cannot control those things, are going to allow you to put into perspective what you see in the data. And all leads to, again, the question of validity and reliability. By validity, we mean, are we really measuring what we want to measure? Again, this looks like a very trivial thing, but it's not. We talk normally about these 4 types of validity. Conclusion validity has to do with this question. Are my conclusions really supported by the data? This is what a lot of people call statistical conclusion validity. So is the analysis really allowing you to make such a conclusion based on the data? We're going to talk about this in subsequent lectures. Then we have internal validity, which have to do with, can you really say that this variable is the cause of this other variable and not something else? How you design your study, there are many different places that it could be wrong or it could go wrong, such that you cannot really claim that something is causing something else. Again, we're going to talk about this in a coming lecture. Then we have construct validity. Are the variables that you measure really the ones reflecting the concepts that you want to study? So is IQ, for example, really measuring intelligence? Yes or no? Is the aroma of the coffee really the only thing measuring the quality of the coffee? Of course not. There's also taste, right? The thickness of the coffee. There's many other things. So is what you're measuring really what you want to measure? And then we have external validity. To what degree can you generalize your results? So if I find that, I don't know, brewing with a certain pressure in the machine is yielding the best quality, can you generalize that to different types of water, different temperatures? Yes or no? So this is what validity is about. And then we have reliability, which is something like how much confidence do we have in the results? How likely is it that if I repeat the study, if I collect the data again, I analyze the data again, I get the same result or I get to the same conclusion? So this is what reliability is about. And again, it's something that we're going to talk plenty about in the coming lecture. And I like to visualize it with this bullseye. Imagine that you're throwing dart. Each dart, it would be the result of one study. And imagine the case in which you don't have a lot of data. It could be this one here or this one here. You don't have a lot of data, but still you can try to answer the research question. If what you're measuring is really what you want to measure, you just don't happen to have a lot of data, then each replication of your study will be off the bullseye. It will not be on the center of the target, but on average, you have the right answer. So there is certain variation because you are not very reliable. The results depend from study to study, but on average, you get the right answer. This would be this case here. If you are not really measuring what you want to measure, you have a certain bias, or imagine you're using a sensor that is it's wrong. It's always measuring a certain temperature. You might be in this situation. On average, you are wrong. You are not on the bullseye. Imagine that you do have a lot of data, but still what you're measuring is not really what you intended to measure. You cannot have access, for example, to the one variable that you wanted. You're using some proxy. You might be somewhere here. This is, if you ask me, where we are with the whole big data thing. We have a lot of data, but really not the one that we wanted to have. Still, there's plenty. So there's very little variation from study to study. We're just not measuring what we wanted to study. This is what we want to have. Enough data so that there's not a lot of variation across studies, and hitting the bullseye on average because we are valid, because we are really measuring what we want to measure. And so all studies are subject to error. We just have to accept it. There's going to be some variation. And we always talk about these two types of error, systematic and random error. Systematic error or bias has to do with validity. So these are errors in the data that are introduced by the measurement instruments. So again, imagine that you have a certain sensors that don't work properly, or you have a bad experimental procedure that does not allow you to differentiate what is the effect of the machine and what is the effect of the brand of coffee. Well, we talked about before. We have confounding. Or just the environment. Maybe everything that we are seeing about whatever we are measuring is because it was raining that day and we cannot do anything about it. So there's a systematic error, a systematic bias in our data, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, the good thing about it is that if you identify it, you are aware of it, sometimes you are able to eliminate. So, for example, in the case of the sensor, if I know that the sensor is always off by 2 degrees, you can just, subtract 2 degrees to your data and you're fine. But this assumes that you have knowledge that the sensor is always wrong by the same amount in the same direction, that there's this systematic bias. Then you might be able to eliminate it. And then random error or noise, it has to do with reliability. And it has to do with the fact that normally you don't look at all the data that you would like to look at, you only look at a sample of data. So if I wanted to study something about the Dutch population, of course I don't have access to the millions of citizens there is in the country. I might only have access to about 1,000 of them. And the results are going to be different depending on which 1,000 I look at. Now, the results might be different by a lot or not, might be very slight differences, very large differences. That's another issue. The thing is, there are differences depending on which 1,000 people you study. And so this error is what we call noise. It's what we call random error because we are not able to explain it. And so these are inherent and unpredictable fluctuations that are in there just because we don't study the full population we want to look at. We only study a sample. And the point is we can neither control it nor explain it. There's nothing we can do about it. The only thing we can do is reduce it. How? By getting an even larger sample or a better sample. We will talk about this in the next lecture. So the important thing is systematic error is always going to be in there. If we detect it, we might be able to eliminate it. Random error is always going to be in there as well, but we're going to be able to reduce it. And it's very important anyway that you realize that always in any data-driven study, any kind of conclusion that you are going to draw from data, you're going to have these two components, systematic and random error. So really, this formula that we were writing down before about the dependent variable being a function of the independent variables, it's always going to be something like this. There is a term for the systematic error, and there is a term for the random error. This one is always going to be in there. This one is always going to be in there, but we can reduce it. We can make it very small with respect to the true thing, with respect to the true effect that we are seeing. And the whole thing about designing the study is about that. The degree to which we can be sure that there is something has to do with what is the size of the effect that we see with respect to the random error in our study. We're going to talk plenty about this. So to sum up, just today, what we have seen is a little bit introduction of data-driven studies, correlational, causal, descriptive, and how we use variables to measure different concepts, their relationships. Third, variable problems, how they are important and how they can basically fool us into concluding something that is wrong. And sources of variability and error. We're going to talk plenty about variability in the coming lecture. And for this week, or for this lecture, I suggest you go online to this page and read that one. The one article is actually a blog by 3 statisticians, and they talk about the 10 tenfolds of data science, what are the principles of data science, if you want. And that would be the lecture for today. I think in terms of time, we are quite okay. I have a few questions. Do you have to consider the validity or reliability before or after the research? Always before. How you plan your study depends on all these things. So, for example, the case we saw earlier about which brands of coffee are going to be brewed in which machines. That's something that you have to determine before you actually collect the data. That would be a case. Or which brands of coffee do you test? Only one, or do you test 10? Which 10? Do you test all Arabic coffee, or do you test other types of coffee? That kind of thing. Do you think, because of background knowledge, that the pressure of the machine is going to have an effect on the response? If yes, then you have to control for it and properly address it in your study. Not just, go ahead and gather data like crazy. You have to first sit down and think, what are the things that might affect the response? And then how can I control them? How can I measure them? And the whole thing gets more complicated, of course. But it's all in the hope that by the time you analyze the data, it's going to be simpler because you accounted for all this when collecting the data. Many times I can tell you this, I've had a lot of people coming to me saying, hey, Julian, we ran this experiment. This is the data that we have. What can we do with it? Well, nothing. You should have come earlier, because if you really wanted to look into this specific problem, you should have collected the data in a different way. You should have run the experiment somehow differently, because this one that you have here does not allow you to answer the research question because of how it was designed. And think about it when you're just given one data set. And, you're a data scientist somewhere, you're given a data set and you have to find something. The degree to which we can really conclude anything meaningful depends on how the data was collected. And again, today we have seen a few things that could go wrong. In the coming lecture, we're going to see some other things that can go wrong in any study if you don't properly account for all this. Anyway, I think I'm talking too much now. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, we can just finish for today. Okay, I think we're done. More information about the course is going to be up end of today, tomorrow. There's not going to be a lecture this afternoon. We had this slot because of something we did last year. We're not going to do it this year because we cannot. We are going to be online. What else? The lecture, this recording is going to be again uploaded once I get it, once it's done. And we will see each other on Wednesday again. I think there's nothing more. If you have any comments, suggestions for how to run the course more smoothly, this is the third time I'm doing this online, and every time I'm doing something differently. If you have seen something that worked very well in another course that you have attended so far, please let me know, and then I can see if it makes sense for this course or not, and we can do it. Let's try to make the best of an online course. Okay, then I'll see you on Wednesday. Nothing else. All right, bye.